We are JoyCorps Studio.
I'm Erica.
I'm Asha.
And I'm Josie.
And together we've been working alongside entrepreneurs from both business and NGO spaces, grassroots community members, and industry thought leaders to facilitate and empower communities to design solutions to the complex, wicked problems they face.
When we say wicked problems, we're referring to problems such as human trafficking, forced migration, water pollution, and drought. Problems that are constantly changing, involve a vast number of stakeholders, and cross organisational and disciplinary boundaries. Every wicked problem is essentially unique, but can also be considered a symptom of another problem.
This podcast grew out of a desire to explore the role and effectiveness of design thinking and systems practice in those contexts. Over the last 3 years, a central theme of our work has been about understanding and exploring the challenges of reintegration for survivors of human trafficking and bonded labor. Through this first series of the podcast, we will dive into the problem of reintegration more deeply. We will explore the role of business structure, microfinance, and fair pay in relation to reintegration. We will learn about the ingredients for a healing-centered workplace and the dynamics of trauma in a South Asian context. We will also explore what true community transformation looks like, and we will learn about the importance of dignified storytelling.
For this episode, we have a teammate and studio advocate, Shweta Kakkar, who graciously interviewed us so that our listeners could get to know a little more about us and how we got here. Shweta leads all operations and communications at JoyCorps. Since we all work remotely, she causes the much required chaos amongst our otherwise very isolated teams. She truly is the glue that brings us together. She's also great at asking questions, which is why we're excited and a little bit nervous for her to be in charge in this episode.
So I am so excited to be doing this pilot podcast episode with you all. And as I said to Erica when we were talking, that having worked together for so many years, I'm just absolutely thrilled that you're doing a podcast, because I've learned such incredible things from the three of you over the years about design thinking, about the work that you do within the anti-trafficking space, and just how you're applying these really beautiful principles and values into your work. And I really find that so important and so needed to be broadcasted, I guess. Let me say that.
Thank you.
So before we talk about the podcast itself, okay, I want to start by understanding what made you feel that now was the right time to start this.
Josie going on maternity leave? I don't know.
We're under
Trying to
time
find
limit.
work for these two.
Keep them entertained. I feel like there was a few reasons that all kind of collided at the same time. The first, I guess, trigger which put it on our horizon or on our minds was we were in Kolkata earlier this year working on a project, and it was the morning and we were running some workshops, and the three of us were just sitting down having one of our discussions about the day and the workshops and the topic and all of the different dynamics that we might encounter in that day. And there was a friend there who was working on a film. Actually, we did interview him for one of our podcasts, Sean. But he suggested, he was like, you guys, you really should record this. Like, this is just really interesting stuff. And I think one of the, I guess, joys and also perhaps challenges to navigate with the work that we do is that because we're not necessarily experts in human trafficking, and our approach is much more about how do we facilitate organizations to, design solutions to the challenges that they face, rather than us saying, oh, we've got the solutions, we're going to come in and teach them to you or equip you to do them. We are kind of, in some ways, a bit like flies on the wall or like detectives, where we can see multiple perspectives from different stakeholders and different people. And we are kind of in this position where we get to carry all of those and hold those. And I think that's one of the things we wanted to do with this podcast was bring those different perspectives that we get to encounter every day through our work just to a wider audience. Because I think especially a lot of the people that are on the podcast are not people you would necessarily always find on podcasts. And so that for us was really important. So I guess that was one of the reasons.
Yeah.
Ash, Erica, can you think of any more?
I think if I can just add on to it, one of the conversations, in fact, we were having was something we all felt quite strong about from what came off the previous day's workshop that we had there. And I feel like, just like Josie was saying, just to add on, because we play the role of facilitators, it's easy, we're kind of detached from the problem per se as opposed to the people we work with, which helps us to think of it from a more critical angle. And so it's like we put our emotions aside and we are able to think of it, yeah, a little more critically. And so I feel like a lot of our conversations um, can be critical that way, not just of the issue, but also the power dynamics in the room, or even of ourselves. And sometimes there's this back and forth that we go even between the three of us, which I think is also what probably initiated Sean to think that way and say that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think we three also really like, and the way that we work also is usually us bouncing ideas off of each other. And so the podcast kind of felt natural in the sense to, and we do a lot of interviews for work for our projects as well. And so this just felt like a really natural way to combine the two. Like invite somebody, ask them what they think about the topic. And these are all people that we've worked with in the past. And so we really, and we thought the points that they've made in different points of time were so valuable that we just thought, hey, why not ask them questions and then let's discuss it later.
Yeah. And Shweta, to add to your question of why now, I think one reason I could think of is now that we've started studio, and I think it's been around 2.5 to 3 years. I feel like last year was one year where the three of us got to work on two projects together from start to the end. And so we just felt like because we were three projects in, we clearly like had a lot to think through. Just, I mean, our process as well as some of the projects we worked on had very, a lot of common themes. And so it would be interesting just to see what could come off of all of it together and just what will unravel off of it. So I guess that was in my head, that was the why now, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Those are really cool insights. And again, last year, when of course you took on, you were working on all of these projects simultaneously. I can imagine, like even in these last few years, talking to you sporadically, almost like one-on-one conversations or something about, hey, this is what we are working on, and this is something that we encountered, and this is what we're thinking about. What I love about the podcast format is how it kind of opens up avenues for, like you said, people who you would never traditionally or conventionally, find on podcasts, or being able to share the deep learnings from the field, from engaging with a wide stakeholder group and such.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
really cool.
I think a dream would really be to have people from communities on the podcast because that would be super cool. I mean, that's some of
Yeah.
the work that we really enjoy doing is
Yeah.
working with the communities and hearing their voices and hearing them speak.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that would be an awesome dream if we ever got a chance to do that.
And in fact, that was something we were intentional about even when we were thinking through guests, right? Like to ensure that at least a good amount of them are from the same context, the South Asian context, as much as possible. So even if not from, but at least has worked in this region
Yeah,
for a good amount of time.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So this actually makes a great segue for me to ask this question about, tell me how you've conceptualized this podcast and who is it for? Do you have a specific audience in mind, or are you just hoping that you'll engage with this wide breadth of audience?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I feel like there are a few different audiences. I think from my perspective, one audience that I feel very passionate about is because the podcast's discussing this area of reintegration for survivors who have been experienced trafficking or bonded labor. And a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years has been around freedom business and around entrepreneurship, which is very in line with what JoyCorps does in terms of supporting entrepreneurs. I know some of the entrepreneurs that we've worked with have also gone through the fellowship program with JoyCorps. And and yeah, I think me also coming from that background of I wasn't running a freedom business as say, but I was running a social enterprise which was providing employment for women. And one of the aspects that I think I went into quite naively with that business was that I I was looking at all of these different models around me of people doing things very similar. And it all just looked like it was going swimmingly. And it all looked like it was the business was profitable. They were helping people. People were finding purpose in their work. They're enjoying what they do. And I think as I started to go down that route of working with people from more marginalized communities in Sri Lanka at the time, but also trying to run a business which was profitable, they're so at jar with each other. And it's very difficult to get that balance of both. And I think there was a process for me of realizing, oh, actually, this, I never thought it was going to be easy, but I didn't necessarily consider the role that NGOs play in supporting those types of businesses. So even businesses which are perhaps providing employment for survivors or for people from vulnerable backgrounds, they will now, I've discovered, they will often have a kind of NGO or social work component to them, which carries the weight of, say, healthcare, or if there's a disaster, or if children need educating or paying for lunches. So there's this piece which is often, yeah, kind of there in the background, especially when you're selling a product. The product is out front, whatever that is. And this NGO side or social work side isn't necessarily spoken about in that same way. And so I think I was looking at these models and not actually realizing what it took to get something like that to fly in terms of the support that it needs and the financial capacity that it needs in order to be able to do that. And through the podcast, we talked to people about what does it look like when people have experienced high levels of trauma in terms of turning up for work each day and sustaining that rhythm and being able to meet orders and being able to also find healing in that. There's so many different dynamics. And so I think one audience that I would really love to reach with this podcast is for people who are considering or thinking about starting a freedom type business or a business along those lines that provides employment for either survivors or people from more marginalized communities, just to help them give them a really realistic understanding of what all of those different dynamics that need to be held together are. And it's not saying that it's not possible, it's exploring actually how could this be possible. And I think the podcast is very positive in that sense, is that it is very solution orientated. And so I think, yeah, for me, one audience would be for entrepreneurs or even both NGO and business entrepreneurs in that sense, exploring what is the role that we play in facilitating or being involved in freedom business in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before I ask Asha and Erica
Yeah.
to give their thoughts into this, Josie, you've touched upon something. So, when I was preparing questions for this podcast, I was like, okay, background, journey, these very neat categories. But of course, the moment I heard you talk about this very thing, which is something we experience so much even at JoyCorps when we are promoting the concept of social entrepreneurship or redemptive entrepreneurship. Why is it so complicated? Is sort of a follow-up question. So I'll break my neat line of questions. And if it's okay, Erica and Asha, I'll come back to asking
Yeah.
you about, and
No,
just
and
ask you girls to reflect on this.
yeah.
Why is it so hard? Like this overlap space of business with a purpose that is beyond profits,
Mm.
or a non-profit looking to be more, what is a word? Looking to be more, I guess, market oriented in its
Or
work.
sustainable, or
Yeah.
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 That is a challenging question, I
It
think.
is. Yeah.
I think one aspect is, and this came up actually, we were talking to someone when we were working on a project in Nepal, and they were talking about just that distinctive role between a social worker and a business person, and how they're very different types of people. And so when an NGO approaches trying to run a business, their natural inclination and intention isn't about profit or even market. It's about looking at, okay, what are the skill sets that either the people in the community have or that we're able to teach or we have capacity to teach? What are the audiences that we already have through our funding networks, perhaps, that we could tap into in a slightly different way? And so the mindset and approach is completely different to if you are someone who is coming purely from a business perspective and wanting to find a way to integrate a social impact essence into what it is you're doing, whether that's benefiting people or the planet or both. And so I think I think one thing is that we don't necessarily acknowledge what aspect we're coming at it from. And then maybe the second thing is that there is space for both, because the more we've explored these models, the more we realize that there is a role that social workers need to play in this. And there is a role that business needs to play. But traditionally, in the freedom business kind of landscape and route, it's relied very much on a export model. So you'll create a product, say in India, with a US market or with a European market, and there isn't necessarily a strong local market for the product, which means that transitioning perhaps to local leadership or local ownership is more challenging, because that local person who might understand and be excellent at their job suddenly has to navigate a whole new market and customer and way of doing things overseas and in a place that they may never have visited. And so it's not to say that that is a wrong model, but it's to say I think through our work that we've been doing has really been exploring like what are the opportunities for local markets and for cooperative models and for these different models of business that could provide freedom, if we're talking about freedom, to the people that it's employing. So I'd say that's one thing that just popped to mind.
Yeah.
If I can just add on to what Josie was saying, I think one common thread that we had for all our podcast episodes, was also the challenge of time, right? Because on one hand, you're talking about reintegration, which in itself is such a slow process. And then there is business, which works in such a fast-paced, we need the markets there, so we need like a good quality, we need it to happen, we have to meet deadlines, but at the same time these are people just coming in with their own share of trauma and difficulties, and for them to work in that environment, in such a fast-paced environment, it's quite it's a struggle in itself. So I feel like even just that whole concept of time, and the challenge of that between the two, I feel is one of the challenges that did come out quite often from most of our guests as well. Yeah.
I don't know, and I think maybe also the way that and I think we've seen this at JoyCorps as well, Shweta, with like the way that traditionally we've viewed businesses and the expectation for a successful business to be up and running in a certain amount of time in with as much like as little capital as possible, and all of those pressures that you put on businesses to do a good job. I feel like if you're talking about a space like this, that you're actually talking about people that have hardships, that have come through so much of hardships, and you actually want to put the people first. I feel like that kind of doesn't work in that system. And so that also tends to be quite challenging as well, to think about it that way. And so maybe it's just needing to reorient the way that we think about redemptive businesses or freedom businesses, and having different definitions for that. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this resonates so much with stuff that we have learned while running programs at JoyCorps, and before that, when I was working at a social enterprise too, because when you actually start, like when you're really in that space, is when you realize, oh, wait, what I think what you've said, Asha, is so correct about this pace with which two things are supposed to work in parallel, right? One that is operating in this really high intense, highly competitive space. You cannot compromise on cost. You cannot compromise on efficiency, which is then tied to cost. You cannot compromise on XYZ. And yet, there is no, like for people who are in this social enterprise or business with purpose or redemptive business space, business means nothing. It's like, food without seasoning, I would say. If you're only there to make profits, right? But that tension exists. And in our fellowship, we always saw there'll be some who say trickle down effect. I have to focus on making profits, and because until my business is profitable, how do I even start thinking about the social purpose? That'll come later. But then there are those who are like, listen, I cannot bring in those quote unquote negative or evil values of like the fast-paced exploitative business environment, because my purpose is not business at all. It is, the business is just like a tool through which I'm going to reach and serve my sort of target audience or beneficiary group. But then that is why I think slowly we came to this understanding that we have to give equal attention to our three areas of focus, which is venture building, social impact, and then an entrepreneur's own formation, because all three are just tested every step of the way.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really cool.
I guess, in fact, we touched upon it in the last episode we did, where we were wondering, even when it comes to freedom businesses, how much of it is on the business when it comes to the well-being of the person working, right? Like,
Yeah.
or is there a line that the business has to draw in sense of, we can try as much as possible to create a conducive environment at work that is not trauma-inducing, but where does the line, like how involved do we get, and when do we step back?
Yeah.
So that's also something that we just touched upon, but I guess just as something to think through.
Mm. Uh, and so just coming back to you've mentioned some episodes and things. So what kind of stories and voices have you brought into these episodes? What are some of the episodes that you've done? What are some other topics you're looking to explore in future episodes?
I think a lot of our episodes for this season have been around the reintegration piece and the challenges to reintegration, and how freedom business attempts to be an answer to those challenges in some ways. And so we've had topics about, that talked about, we actually took the six the codes of excellence from the Freedom Business Alliance, and we use those as pointers, as themes, to sort of have people talk about them, because I think they apply slightly differently within the Indian context as well. And we've come across like slight deviances from that within the work that we've done as well. And so, yeah, for future episodes, I don't know. I feel like the world is our oyster.
Season 2. Officially, what is that? When you say it's official, season 2 is coming.
We'll see how this season goes, and then I don't know.
I guess also, Shweta, going back to your previous question on who do you
Yeah,
think is the audience,
correct.
just in light to what Erica was sharing, I feel a lot of what we do is also social mapping, right? Like systems practice. So as you think of a wicked problem, you realize that there are way many stakeholders that need to be involved, as usually is the case. And so I feel like this time also we've tried to bring in people, like we've had an episode on like microfinance. So we've gotten a person who is more into the finance aspect of it. Then we have a doctor who talks about community transformation. We have someone coming in who's a storyteller, and then how do you tell these kind of stories?
Mm.
We have someone who works in the aftercare. So basically, with communities that are survivors of bonded labor. So basically, try to understand trauma in Indian context. So we've tried as much to bring in people of different areas, and I think it's more to do with, again, our way of working, where it's not just focused on one particular area, right? And we need to bring all of them together in the same space to when we're
Mm.
thinking of an issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that was the real motivator and perhaps another audience is that whilst we were doing the projects that we've been doing in South Asia, we've realized that there isn't as much research that's been done around anti-human trafficking and reintegration in the South Asian context versus the Southeast Asian context.
Mm.
And I think one of our inquiries as we expand on this work and as we take this work forward is really, what are the similarities and where can the research be kind of cover both areas? And where is actually the Indian or South Asian context very different to the Southeast Asian context when it comes to this issue? And hoping that this podcast and some of the work that we do after this podcast, in terms of we're hoping to write more about reintegration and freedom business moving forward in 2026 in the South Asian context, but hoping that that can really add to the dialogue and conversation that's happening here and feed into it in a really helpful way. So I guess also for people who are interested in learning more about it in the South Asian context or
Mm.
who work here, and I always think that when you put something out into the world, although it's a bit risky, it always is so
Yeah.
generative in terms of who hears it or who who responds to it. And I guess one of the hopes is that putting these discussions out and these conversations out, that people do respond and they do say, "Oh yeah, I've got this experience in this area," or "I was really struggling with this," and there's a much wider dialogue that can start to happen around some of these challenges and opportunities that we've encountered.
Mm. Wow, that's really powerful, and that's very, very beautiful, because you're right. When we start something, whether it's a program, it's a project, it's a podcast in this case, there are some things that are quite measurable, right? You'll be able to see, oh, these are the number of listeners, and this is the kind of engagement we were able to reach. But then what fascinates me a lot, or that often gives me a lot of, I don't know why, it just like makes me smile, is when I think about uh, the ripple effect that something that you put out there is going to invariably have, even in the way of like, oh, I just stumble upon this podcast, but then I hear it, and suddenly it just opens my eyes wide to either the concept of systems thinking, or design thinking, or anti-human trafficking movement and things like that. So yeah, that's very cool. I'm glad you're doing this. Okay, so now I want to know more about your individual journeys and then the journey of JoyCorps Studio. But I'll start with, just can you share a little bit about your journey? What led you to human-centered design thinking and then the formation of JoyCorps Studio?
Mm.
I think Josie should start
Yeah,
that one.
yeah, you should start it.
Okay.
It starts in Sri Lanka,
It
That's
probably does,
in the
It
actually.
hills
does.
of.
It definitely does on that little island. Um,
In
so
South
yeah,
Asia.
in South Asia. Um, yes. So yeah, so I mentioned that I had been running a social enterprise in Sri Lanka, and we had come out of COVID and we had managed to survive COVID. And then Sri Lanka experienced a big economic crash, which it's still recovering from really in terms of its debt and everything. Um, but for running a business, and this is where my conflict really arose between having a business and then having an NGO. And what is this? Because when you we got through COVID, but then when it got to this next challenge, which was only really less than a year after, really, I think, um, financially, it was just very difficult to sustain what it was we were doing. And I was also experiencing challenges around visas and around, um, where I was going to live. And I had some big life changes. And there was just a big, what's the word? Culmination of things that kind of led me to ending that business in certain ways at that point. And one of the big questions that I had, though, and which I was struggling with, was that my intention was always for it to be locally led, or self-sufficient. And getting to that point was really difficult because I had built it where it relied so much on me, and mainly me from being a Western connection to our markets. And I realized that I kind of had this question in my head, like, is it possible? How do you start something, or how do you work with people to start something? Or what does that even look like in a way that it becomes there's ownership from everybody in it, and that it isn't reliant on one person, whoever that person is. And that was something I was getting really intrigued about, and it led me to studying my master's in the UK on ecological design thinking, which explored design in different contexts and really looked a lot at wicked problems. And so human trafficking would be a wicked problem, climate change, poverty. Wicked problems are basically very complex. There's lots of different stakeholders, lots of industries are involved, lots of geographical boundaries. They're very difficult to solve. And in fact, it's kind of spoken about that you don't really solve them. You just try and find solutions that move the system towards a better place rather than a more negative place. And so that master's really opened my mind to thinking about looking at these challenges on a systems level. And one of the things that drove me with that business in Sri Lanka, looking back now, was the challenges that it was trying to solve. It wasn't
Mm.
really the profit. And I was definitely much more on that social
Yeah.
side than the business side. Although I was adamant that it was going to be a profitable business, which I think was the conflict. But I was just so keen on figuring, okay, well, there's all of these different challenges. Like women were having to migrate to the Middle East to find work from the tea estate area. The All of the deforestation of the tea area was meaning that there was big landslides that were happening now. The climate was changing. What is the role that we could play in that? And so I was so fascinated by how this business and this group of women could create something which could start to solve problems. And so going through my master's, my thinking just really shifted. And it was actually at the end of that master's that the economic crash kind of happened, and I decided to end the business. But a lot of the project work that I did was around problem mapping in Sri Lanka. And I was at the time on the JoyCorps Fellowship program with that business. And our boss, Sam, had been in different conversations with some organizations in Nepal around their big challenge of reintegration. And there was two different organizations, and both of them were doing amazing work and were very experienced in the rescue and rehabilitation of young women who had been trafficked. But when it came to reintegration, they'd been trying lots of different things, but with limited success. And so Sam basically saw this opportunity for a kind of a problem mapping and research design thinking project to occur with these two organizations. And so that's how Studio got started. And it was never supposed to be a studio, really. It was initially just this one project.
One project. Wow. Yeah.
One project. And then Asha came on board towards the end of that project when we were kind of writing up the report. And we had another colleague, Luke, who kind of came on board as well towards the end of that project to look at how we could turn what it is we're doing into something more, yeah, stable. I guess it was a kind of startup within an existing NGO organization, and what were the different elements that we need to put in place? Like, how do we think through this? What are our next projects going to be? And it kind of grew. And then Erica came on board as well. And yeah, so it's about, I guess, 3 years since that first project. And actually, that first project, which was around reintegration, has been a very continual thread for our other projects as well. And so, yeah, that was kind of how Studio started and my journey to where we are now. But I
Starting
guess,
studio.
say again,
Just starting studio.
starting a studio. But I think one thing I was so keen about was just how do you co-design with other people? And what are the tools that mean that everyone has a say, everyone has a voice, that all voices are heard, and how can that be captured, especially when you're working with organizations that have very top-down structures? How do the people at the top hear the voices of the people at the bottom and vice versa? And
Yeah.
so I think that's something that we've been able to explore in Studio and been able to integrate different workshops and techniques to try and hopefully facilitate that happening.
That's really cool. And on this topic of research and knowledge production, that is, uh, that's more inclusive, that's actually participatory. Asha, segue to you, because Dr. Sahab holds a PhD and comes from this academic background that is critiqued for being quite top down. So what was your journey then, Asha, coming out from your PhD and then into the world of design thinking?
So I am more of it. My journey, it happened by chance. That's the truth of it, in short. But just to, so I basically did my PhD in international relations specifically. My topic was understanding incorporation of Asian Americans and Hispanics in US presidential elections. So understanding what their voting behavior is like during around four US presidential elections from 2000 to 2012. I submitted my PhD in 2022, and the plan was to go to Dehradun and just chill for 2 months. And that's when I randomly bumped into Sam. And so the conversation was more him trying to understand about my PhD and just what kind of research I do. But as I explained, it ended up with him saying, "Hey, we just started this project and we're writing a report, and we're at that phase where we would like someone to come and give us some contextual research to it." And in my head, I was ready to go back to working in a think tank in Delhi, one that I had initially worked for. And so I heard him out, and I said, "Give me some time. Let me get back to you." And I feel like as I thought through it, I realized that this is definitely a very different journey because on one hand, for almost 7 to 8 years, I was understanding the system from the perspective of how a policy is made. But I also realized with that top down approach, you don't really understand, I don't really understand the bit of once the policy is made, how do communities then experience that policy? And so I felt like it would be a very interesting thing to sign up for and just understand that, because even though my research for my PhD was a policy level aspect was there to it. I was still studying two communities, that is Hispanics and the Asian Americans, and so I realized that not having that kind of not having that experience in understanding communities better would was something that I wanted to sign up for. And I also feel like right now, I know, so sorry to rewind. And that's why I said yes. And then I got to see Josie do her magic and just experience design thinking from her lens, right? And how she approaches it. And so for me, again, it was all so new, very new to it all, but very different from the kind of research that I did, like you said, top down versus bottom up approach. Um, and I felt like this is something I have mentioned a couple of times, but when you do a lot of the policy research, data comes to you, and then you do the work on the data, but then you miss the bit of how there are actually people behind the data, right? And the sensitivity of that is something you kind of miss over the years. So I feel like that's just something that's really drawn me towards design thinking, the fact that you are working with communities, but you also get this opportunity to get stakeholders to come around these communities to also remind you that at the end of the day, these are the people you're working for, and they are as crucial to the decision making as the rest of them are around them.
Yes.
So I feel like that's something that's drawn me towards it. And I feel like also right now I'm in the space where, now that I know how a decision is made, and now that I know how communities experience it, what is that middle ground? Like, where do these two perspectives meet eventually at some point? I'm sure they do, but what does that look like? Yeah, so that's been my journey with
Wow.
JoyCorps Studio.
Really cool. And Erica, now I'd love to hear yours, because I remember when you came to JoyCorps, you and I worked for a little bit in monitoring and evaluation, right? I don't know if you remember
Yes,
that.
we
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Did.
So we were developing these different ways
Yeah,
in which, and we were brainstorming on how
yeah.
can we
I think we're
capture our
still, I
data.
think JoyCorps is still brainstorming on some of that. But even years later.
Yep.
Um, but
And then the next thing I know, sorry, is that we get this notification that Erica is now going to be part of JoyCorps Studio. And I never got a chance to ask you how that happened. So tell me now.
okay, so a little bit of backstory. Ever since I was, I don't know, 15 or 16, I volunteered with an anti-trafficking organization.
Oh.
And I sort of knew that that is what, at that point in time, I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And so all through college, I think my aim was to getting to that place of working with an anti-trafficking organization. And I did. I actually worked for one for a very long time. And that's also how I got into data and really enjoying working with data and really organizing information and yeah, trying to read between the lines and stuff like that. And so, but I think it was during that job that I felt like the most, like I enjoyed what I did, but I also saw such big gaps and such big challenges to what we were doing. Because on the one hand, like what the work that they were doing was so great. But on the other hand, there were just like these big flaws that were staring at your face, like the fact that sometimes women would run away from shelter homes, and even though you'd rescue them from really intense amounts of trauma, it's still like the program still wasn't enough for them to want to choose that direction, I guess, or it still wasn't making that change that you wanted to see. And so that in itself was such a big challenge. And then I think I moved on from that organization and I worked with an education organization, providing education to marginalized communities living in big cities. And even then, it was like you provided these programs to children, but children didn't actually want to take them.
Yeah.
And I feel like that to me was like, I don't know what's happening. Like, I know the programs are good, and I know that like the people that do choose it do really well and succeed, and you can hear these great success stories, But then you also hear of these stories that don't actually work out. And it's like the stories that don't work out, like why don't they work out? I guess that was what I was like, I don't know, I think we're missing the gap somewhere. Or there's a big gap and we're unable to bridge that. And so after that, I decided, okay, I'll take a break from this. Um, and then over the years, I think I got, yeah, I took on smaller projects with nonprofits, just writing reports and stuff like that. And then I came to JoyCorps eventually. And even that happened by chance, but that's a whole different story. But when I got to JoyCorps, I think the thing that really excited me was the businesses that took on that also had this social venture, because they were looking at it not from oh, I want to help people, but I also want to do this business, and because I do this business, I get to help people. And I think that for me was a different way of looking at not really the nonprofit space, but just the space to work on some of these challenges. And it was just a different way that you approach a challenge, whether it be anti-trafficking, or whether it be education, or whether it be providing employment for women who come from marginalized communities, you know. And so that's how I got into JoyCorps. And then that's when we started working with the monitoring evaluation. That's what I was initially brought on for. But then I realized that it wasn't something I realized, but we had a business reimagine summit, and I think that was the one that Josie was doing the project with Nepal. And she had this, I wasn't at any of her sessions, but she had this big chart out where she had little cards and little place marker flags
I
and
remember that, yeah.
little string, like little pieces of string connecting dots from one to another. And it was I think at that moment, I was like, that's what I want to do.
Like from that
That looks
data-driven mind that
fascinating.
you have. Yeah.
Yes,
It was
yes, because for me, that was like, oh my gosh, this is data that is visual, but that's also so accessible to everybody.
yeah.
And I don't think I mentioned this to Sam at that point of time. And so I don't actually know how he drew the connection in his head eventually. But he eventually asked me if I wanted to join the team, and I was like, yes,
Oh, wow.
down. I'm
Very cool.
so down. And so I think it's that whole idea of still using data, but in being in such creative, non-monotonous ways to reach people, and to even ask people to come alongside and, you know, share their information with us, because we work with communities at the end of the day. And so how do you work with communities if you don't invite them in, right? And if you're not as inviting, like it's something that they should also want to do. And so one of the projects that we did last year had us do a workshop where we invited people to color, and just seeing people color after, you know, and some of them said, we haven't colored in like since we were kids, but this is great. And so just that idea of yeah, everybody being able to partake in something and just learning another way of learning about people. I think that's been pretty cool.
That's amazing. That is so cool. And girls, I'm having so much fun. I want this to become an Andrew, what is that guy? Huberman? 2 hour long podcast. Have you guys
Oh.
heard? So I don't want, basically what I'm trying to say is I
Lot.
want the conversation to go on for another hour at least. Let's talk about the future then in order to wrap this up.
Mhm.
So like you said, studio has been around for a few years now. You've done some really great projects. You worked in areas like efforts for reintegration of survivors of trafficking. You worked in bonded labor. You've also done this really great project trying to understand how you can build these communities of cares. You like in the US foster care system. And I'm sure you'll share this information with your listeners. But now, what does this next season of JoyCorps Studio look like?
I think we we had the a mission given to us, and that was to figure out what our goal was for the coming year. And I remember we were on a call with Luke, and he asked us this question, which which sounded very scary, but it made sense as to why he asked us. And he said, if studio were to shut down in the next 1 year, what is the one thing you would want to make sure you want to do? Um, and I think off of that is when we started thinking through, okay, wait a minute, what have we done so far? You know, and he said that whatever it is that you do, like it should be something that you leave strong on, right? Like and so I think for me personally, one thing that did come to mind was about reintegration and freedom businesses, and like I said, it's also because the three projects that we did do had were on similar lines. And so I think the thought process was that clearly there has to be something that came off of all three. Um, and if there is something, that's definitely something that we can look to understand and put out there and challenge the status quo, right? And so even when I was thinking about it, it was scary for me because as individuals, we are also very introverted. So keeping the peace is always our first choice. But it was also that thing of what, like, if it closes, what are you going to do, right? So it was this sudden jolt, and with it came this thought of, okay, end with a bang, if that's what it needs to be. Don't know if it's going to be a bang, but um
Might be.
might be,
Yeah,
exactly right.
And
I
we
think
might also
so.
end. Who knows?
Oh no. So I guess for me personally, that's also what at least the next 1 year looks like.
Yeah.
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 I think we're also trying to look at more projects that are South Asia focused,
Hmm.
maybe more projects that are more vulnerable communities and climate focused, climate change. You know how looking at the different aspects of a system that kind of interconnect with each other, but also don't have very obvious connections, and sort of try to do some work around that. Might be cool.
That sounds really cool. And then, Josie, what does this year look like for you
Raising a new baby.
raising a new?
Yeah. So I'm having a baby soon. She probably by the time this podcast's out,
Yeah.
hopefully there will be a baby in the world.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it brings a very different dynamic to the work that I'll be doing, I guess. And but also I think I'm excited to explore what it looks like to continue exploring these problems and these projects with Ash and Erica with a baby. And
While changing nappies.
while
Yes.
changing nappies and feeding.
Feeding.
And yeah, because I feel like we're in such um turbulent times in many ways, and there's so much going on that I can't imagine my mind is gonna rest or ignore it or put it to bed because there's a baby. And I think I've always found a lot of joy from having that sense of purpose, and my work definitely gives me that, what we're doing with the studio. And I'm excited for Ash and Erica to take it forward over the next few months. And we're still working on a project, and like Ash has said, we're going to be moving into this thinking about the freedom business stuff more. And also working more with JoyCorps as well, with some of the entrepreneurs that are coming through the programs that you guys are also running, which will be really cool. And so, yeah, there's a slightly different pace perhaps for me, but I think also that creates space. And I'm kind of hoping, and I think one of our when Ash was talking about how our approach is going to be in 2026,
Hmm.
if we only had 1 year definitely like a boldness was something which we all felt was important.
Yeah.
Just being able to kind of speak with boldness and be able to share what it is we're actually finding without necessarily the fear of what people might say or what might happen. And I think I'm hoping that the baby will give me a bit of boldness in some ways.
I was also thinking, Josie, you said that, you have a heart for, just with everything that's going on, especially to make this world a better place. I feel like I'm sure it'll only increase with the baby, considering the baby is going to be a part of that same world.
Right? Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's true. That's true.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for just letting me be or inviting me to be involved, in this first sort of episode and just talking about the journey that you've taken to get here. What does this look like, and the journey you're hoping to take from here too. So, all the best.
Thanks, Shweta.
Oh.
That was so great.